Hello, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. Now, this is the second session of the second topic of the semester titled Long Distance Trade, Climate Change, and Epidemics in the Making of the Early Modern World. Here in this session, we're going to proceed with looking at part one, the rise and expansion of global trade networks. We already saw in the first session a series of trading systems that connected different civilizations together, like the Silk Road, for example, across Eurasia from China all the way to Europe. We looked at the Southeast Asian network as well, that started with the Kingdom of Funan, and then the Malaysian clan seized control of the Straits of Malacca and that passage and created an empire, a trading empire there, controlling the flow of goods from Asia to the Middle East and the Mediterranean. This is a navigation, of course, a network, Sriwijaya, as it is called. And we also look at the African network that connected West Africa and the Saharan Desert, that was largely sponsored through the export activities of the Kingdom of Mali as well. So here we're going to continue looking at two more of those networks, and after we do that, we're going to see how they're going to intersect and interconnect once we move into the 13, 14, and 1500s. And then we're going to proceed by looking at part two, which is going to look at climate change. Okay, all right, so let's turn to our outline. And once again, we are looking at a fourth trading system that emerges as a major center of world trade around the 1200s AD. And this is going to be a very dominant center for world trade until, roughly speaking, 1450. And we're talking about the Indian Ocean. Okay, the Indian Ocean will indeed become a region that attracted thousands of merchants coming from different parts of the world, particularly Asia and the Middle East and East Africa. And that will be like a nexus point, a meeting center for the exchange of products that were coming back and forth. Let me show you the map so you can have a visual of how significant this nexus point is going to be for creating yet another network that not only connected, like I said, China with the Middle East and the Mediterranean, but also with East Africa. And those continents are going to now come together through this system of commercial exchange that, remember, this is not just East Africa. By this time, we have the West African Saharan network as well that reaches all the way to East Africa. So it is also interconnecting pretty much a great portion of the African continent as well. We're going to see that within this network, there will be major centers of trade, which were really centers that received imports and, of course, also merchants arriving from the mainland to export products overseas. For example, in Africa, Mozambique will become such important international center. Again, so this is really a major international port for imports and exports. In the Persian Gulf, we see Hormuz. Hormuz in the Persian Gulf will become also one of the major international centers whereby Middle Eastern products were exported out into the network, and of course those that came from the outside were into the Middle East came from that point as well, Hormuz. In India, we see Calicut, okay, will become one of those major also centers of international trade. In Southeast Asia, once again, we covered that in the previous session. The Straits of Malacca continues to be a major highway as well, and a nexus point that connected Chinese products with the rest of the network as well. And in China, we also see the development of a major international center as well, and that is Guangzhou. Okay, Guangzhou will become, again, the major port of China in this major network. Now, one of the reasons why East Africa is going to be integrated into this new emergent system has to do with growing knowledge of sea currents and wind currents as well. By this time, merchants that were navigating back and forth, even going back all the way to the times of the Kingdom of Funan, for example, in Southeast Asia, and Srivi Java as well, in the Straits of Malacca, what actually occurred is that merchants, as they were moving back and forth across the region, started really building up knowledge about the ocean and how it worked. And one of the things that they paid attention to is that there were seasonal monsoons. Those are actually wind currents that bring significant rain, particularly into the Indian subcontinent and parts of the Middle East as well. And they occurred in specific times of the year. There are those that actually move north in one part of the year, whereas in the other part of the year, the monsoon actually moves south. So what merchants were actually doing is that they were paying attention to that pattern and moving along the monsoon in order to either be moving north and south, and this is how they got to East Africa. And this is how they started interconnecting more directly with the East African societies and connecting, of course, not only East Africa, but really the rest of the network into the system as well. Okay, so we have a system that, as we move into the 1500s, was really one of the most trafficked waterways in the whole world. More merchants were moving cargoes and merchandise across this network than in any other part of the world. Again, it was vibrant just in the Indian Ocean, in India itself, in the southern tip of the Indian subcontinent. There were really not only thousands of merchants, there were tens of thousands of merchants arriving from different parts of the network, from China, from Persia, from East Africa, from the Straits of Malacca, and so on again. So this is going to become a major network, and pay attention to this, because as we're going to be moving now in the next topic, for example, the rise of the trading empires, there will be intense competition over this network. Once the Europeans entered the race, particularly the Portuguese, as we'll see, there will be intense competition over who controlled the network. And one of the major nexus points as well, the Indian Ocean, will be highly contested, as we'll see. Again, this is going to be significant for our conversation moving along the timeline. In this network, what we see is Chinese silks and ceramics, porcelains, for example, moving west across this network. There was a great demand for silk still, not only in India or Southeast Asia, but particularly in the Middle East, in Persia, and also in the Mediterranean world, in Europe. And one of the major consumers of Chinese silk was Europe at this time. We also see Southeast Asian spices. In Southeast Asia, what we see in a series of islands, we have a series of societies, most of which were peasants, growing spices, different kinds of spices, particularly like cinnamon, for example, cloves, pepper, black pepper, for example, nutmeg, and mace as well, which found a market both in China but also in the Middle East and also in India as well. Now, of course, India will become a major producer of spices, and there will be a certain competition between Southeast Asia, the Straits of Malacca, for example, Malaysia, and India in the spice trade. And those were the major producers of spices. And this is going to become, of course, very, very critical when the Europeans discover the spices. And there will be, of course, a certain competition between different European empires to control the spice trade, as we'll see. Okay, so again, this is really leading us into the 15, 16, and 1700s, with the rise of Europe to prominence in world trade, for example. Okay, so the spice trade was really one of the main motivators for Europeans to step out of Europe and begin participating in this kind of international network, as we'll see. Now, in this network, something we covered in the first session, we're not only looking at commercial exchange. People are not just moving commercial goods along the network, but also what we see is that there is an exchange of cultural and also technological, religious ideas as well in this process. We see, for example, that across this network, we see the emergence of multi-ethnic communities. Merchants are moving along the network, and they're not just carrying goods from one place to another. In many cases, they arrive, for example, Muslim merchants arrive to India and they settle there. We talked about that in the first session. They also arrive to Southeast Asia. And there's a back and forth. Again, Indian merchants also moving to Southeast Asia and so on. Chinese merchants move into India and so on. And we see the formation of multi-ethnic communities. So again, this is part of this process of cultural exchange leading to this phenomenon of globalization, the integration of world cultures. There's also an exchange of plants, animals, and foods. So, one of the reasons why there are certain parallels, let us just say, in Asia as a whole when it comes to foods, although each region creates their own food culture that is very distinct, there are certain shared characteristics, and those are the spices, for example. Okay, the use of certain spices, is very common, whether we're looking at the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and China, for example. So there's again a sharing of cultural values, cultural practices, like foods, for example, and so on. And this is really creating not necessarily a uniform cultural region, but there is significant syncretism, so to speak, a blending together of many cultures into a single culture, so to speak. Okay. There's also, of course, technological exchange. Merchants that travel from point to point across the network share also knowledge regarding, for example, navigation skills, navigation devices that allow them to improve their vessels, for example, to travel long distances, to feel more secure in the ocean, and so on. So we see a kind of technological revolution of sorts that is taking place in the Indian Ocean. Again, what we see, for example, is that the Arabs develop a certain device to orient themselves on the high seas by actually studying the sky, the stars, and identifying them, their location, and producing or generating a certain device that will be able for them to actually measure, for example, the degrees within the ocean from where they are with those constellations, so they will know where they're going. This is what is known as the astrolabe. It was in Arabian, in the Arabic language, this was called the Kamal, for example, the Kamal. It's something like this. Again, it looks something like this. You create this device, and then you measure the angles of the stars, and you know their position. So therefore, you know where you're going, whether you're moving east, west, north, south, etc. Again, it will actually orient people. Consider this as one of the very first GPS systems, so to speak, that navigators began to use. So as the Arabs are producing this device, they're going to share it, of course, across the network, and this is going to be an exchange taking place in that other navigators, whether they're Chinese, for example, or Indian, and so on, they're also getting a hold of this gadget, and they're also going to put it to good use by testing their navigation skills on the high seas, by really studying the sky. So the sky itself will be pretty much a map, a certain GPS system. Again, that navigators, particularly the captains of those ships, needed to really study very well and understand and master. So slowly but surely we see a navigation revolution taking place in world history, something that will be accelerated, as we'll see, by the Portuguese. Also, the Chinese, having invented also a magnetic compass that also allows them to orient themselves, because this compass always points north, for example, and there were several versions of this compass as well. So by the time of the Indian Ocean network, the Chinese had kind of advanced a more sophisticated version of this, and this is something that navigators used in order to know where they were going. And this was essential, again, for long distance trade, particularly, again, to advance and expand long distance trade. In terms of religion, we also see the diffusion of religious ideas as well. Islam, for example, is going to spread along the network. This is something that we saw earlier in the previous topic at the end in Southeast Asia, and that's true. Particularly, we're going to see a significant conversion taking place, particularly of the rulers of Southeast Asia, which were Buddhist. They had actually converted to Buddhism in previous times when they were mainly dealing with Chinese and Indian merchants, which were Buddhist, and there was a conversion of Southeast Asia to Buddhism that facilitated pretty much the trade because they shared the same faith. But now that the Muslims are moving across the network, creating communities, creating mosques, those are religious structures, those are the temples of the Muslims and so on, and they're abiding by religious laws and so on, creating a common culture across the network. They're slowly but surely dominating pretty much a certain segment of the trade. And because they're becoming more and more dominant, Southeast Asian rulers, which were Buddhist, found it expedient to convert to Islam, not necessarily because they had a change of mind necessarily, Although that I think over time they really adopted certain views or convictions of the Muslim faith, without a doubt. But initially, this conversion was also expedient in that one of the norms of the Muslims when it came to commerce, for example, was to provide a tax exemption to Muslim merchants and Muslim rulers. They were not to be paying taxes because they were, of course, part of the Islamic world. So when the Southeast Asian rulers learned about that particular custom or norm, they found it convenient in a very practical way to save monies or taxes and convert to Islam, and in this way, of course, be tax exempt. Now, over time, the Muslim merchants and rulers from the Middle East started losing significant revenues because, again, more and more merchants along the networks really just started converting to Islam, not paying taxes. So at some point they started, reversing that norm and requiring the merchants and the rulers to pay taxes regardless of their faith. This is a process whereby religious beliefs, faiths, and ideas spread across the network, but at the same time, keep that in mind that in many cases people convert because they are indeed in a commercial network as well. So there are certain practical benefits, so to speak, to convert to another faith. This is something that we saw, for example, also in North Africa with the Kingdom of Mali, for example. The other network I want to discuss is the Mediterranean system. And this is emerging particularly in two merchant cities of the Italian peninsula. Is largely dominated, in other words, by two cities, merchant cities in this case, Genoa and Venice. So during the Middle Ages, Genoa and Venice will become really major centers of international trade, meaning that goods that were brought into Europe across the Mediterranean, either they were brought from Africa or they were brought from the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Middle East, for example, they will have to move into the Italian peninsula across those cities, and then those cities will turn around and then sell those products into the other principalities and kingdoms across Europe. So they were kind of the middleman between Europe and Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean world, particularly the Middle East. So during the Middle Ages, what we see is Genoa and Venice really becoming a society of merchants. This is really a merchant society per excellence. Now, as you can see, Venice was in the eastern part of the peninsula and Genoa on the western section. So therefore, each city dominated a region of the Mediterranean. Genoa, the western region, particularly, they controlled the trade with Spain and North Africa, whereas Venice controlled the eastern section of the Mediterranean that connected with Constantinople or the Byzantine Empire, as you can see in this map. Okay, so they kind of divided the Mediterranean world into two parts, and this was a common understanding that they were going to proceed in this fashion, although from time to time there will be rivalries between those two cities, competition over the network that they had been creating, and there were occasional wars between those cities. So this is not just, again, a kind of a peaceful coexistence or agreement to divide the Mediterranean world, there were, of course, rivalries between them as well. For the most part, those cities imported certain products that were coming from, once again, North Africa and the Middle East, and also from the Far East, like silk, for example. So the Chinese silks coming into this network from the Silk Road entered Europe through Venice and Genoa. Okay, grain as well was imported, salt, coal as well. So those are the major, not the only ones, but one of the major commodities that those cities imported into Europe. And of course, from there, the merchants will sell them across the continent. They also exported products to the outside that found markets, whether in Constantinople or in the Middle East or in North Africa, like textiles, olive oil, wine, cheese, cured meats, and other manufactured goods. Okay, and like I said, they were indeed merchants that served as middlemen to the European kingdoms. So those merchants from Venice and Genoa are going to really become very, very wealthy. And they're going to not only control the Mediterranean network, but in so many ways, they are going to create some of the very first changes in the European continent, economic changes, for example, that are going to give rise to the first stages of a commercial economy, a commercial revolution that is market-oriented, and also to the very first financial institutions. And this is going to be really the foundation for the rise of capitalism, for example. Okay? For example, they are the ones that are creating a standardized coin system. They create what is called the gold ducats, or the ducats. Okay, it's a trade coin. So gold is being used as the means of exchange in this system of trade. Whenever they sell silks or they sell salt and so on, they are selling it for gold again. So they create this money, in other words, and this not just the money of those two cities. This really becomes the money of a series of kingdoms of Europe as well. They're beginning to operate under this new coin, for example. They also create financial institutions. One of the reasons why this is so is because the merchants become incredibly wealthy, as a result of this trade. And whenever anybody required a loan, because there were no banks, during for example, the Middle Ages or even the High Middle Ages, for example, the person to turn to was a merchant, whether that was an ordinary citizen, for example, whether that was a ruler, a king or a prince. Whenever they require a loan in order to wage war and so on, they will turn to the merchant, and they will borrow, a loan and for an interest. And so therefore they are the major lenders, if you will, of monies to other merchants, to citizens, but also to rulers as well. And so they are really the forerunners of the very first financial institutions. Over time, the merchants will be creating the very first banks in Europe. And really, they're going to serve as the blueprint for the banking system in the world as well. Again, this is emerging in Italy, in those two cities particularly. Okay, and this is significant because those banks are going to provide finance for the formation of other trading companies. Again, so the modern day, for example, company, which was called the joint stock companies, and which was really the forerunner of the modern day corporation, was largely financed by the Italian, or in this case, the Venetian and Genoese financial institutions. So this is leading to the very first stages of modernity, so to speak. It's really opening up a new world, the early modern world, and a world based on commerce, based on trade, based on monetary systems, based on finance, and also in the formation of overseas outposts or companies that are going to establish not only trading outposts, but over time, as we'll see, colonies as well. Okay, the process of colonization, as we're going to get to see that. Now, as a result of the merchants becoming so significant, so critical in society, the rulers that controlled those cities eventually granted independence to those cities because many of those rulers were actually indebted to them. So one way to compensate for the debt and as a sort of gesture of appreciation and gratitude to keep the merchants happy, in other words, to keep the merchants really working for the ruler in that regard, the rulers granted those cities a charter of rights, the rights to form their own independent city-state. No, those cities are going to become really republics, in other words, self-governed, and the merchants will be the ones in charge of those cities, making the rules and so on, the rules of trade. They're pretty much controlling the politics, in other words, of the cities as a whole. They're being given rights, the Charter of Rights, in other words. Consider it like a Bill of Rights. So even the idea, of the Bill of Rights, for example, that will later on become central in the formation of representative governments, like in England, for example, in the 1600s with the English Bill of Rights, or the American Revolution, for example, and the creation of the United States with a Bill of Rights, and so on, and France, and so on. This idea really goes back to this time as well, when the merchants are being given those rights by their rulers to self-govern their cities. And again, this is really establishing a precedent again for the future. This occurred in the 10th and 12th centuries AD. Okay. Now, at some point, we're going to see a commercial revolution taking place that will bring together all of the networks that we have discussed so far. The Silk Road, the Southeast Asian network, the African network, the Indian Ocean, and the Mediterranean Ocean. And they're all going to intersect, and they're going to, at some point, function as a single whole, although it was not centralized by any means. Okay, this is not a centralized and well-organized and planned network, but rather that the goods generated, let's say, by one end of the network, whether it is in India, Southeast Asia, China, Africa, and so on, really is now circling across the entire network. Okay, it's just the highway has been established, in other words. So there's going to be a commercial revolution taking place as we move into the 13 and 1400s. It's a worldwide commercial revolution, a revolution in commerce, where again the markets are, the economies of the world are moving towards the market, in other words. Okay, so remember, prior to this time, markets were rather local and regional oriented. People produce, for the most part, for their communities, for their kingdoms, for their regions. And occasionally, there will be, of course, certain products that went outside, again, into the world, of course. But now, what we're going to see is that more and more the economies of China, for example, India, and North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, is going to start now gravitating gradually towards the outside, to produce something for exports and to also increase also the imports, particularly of gold, for example. There's going to be that kind of idea now that each party, each civilization, or each society, kingdom, group that is engaged in the network is trying to maximize exports and trying to bring in as much as possible the gold into the system. Again, so this is the kind of commercial revolution that is unfolding, and it begins in the 13 and 1400s, and it will accelerate as we move into the 15, 16, and 1700s, as we'll see. So this is the early origins of that. And of course, one of the persons that is credited for starting this commercial revolution was an Italian merchant from the city of Venice, Marco Polo, who took on this expedition to the Far East. He wanted to travel to the Far East in order to bring exotic items, exotic products that they could commercialize. His family was a family of merchants, and they wanted that to discover other goods beyond silks. They were sure that in faraway lands there might be something that they could import into Europe, so they could actually sell it in the European market and increase their revenues. Gold in this case. And so he's going to accompany his father and uncle into the Far East, traveling along the Silk Road, and they're going to be moving all the way to the Far East, reaching China across this network. Of course, this is an expedition that took so many years. He was really gone for several decades in this major expedition. So before Christopher Columbus, there was another Italian explorer who made a kind of discovery for the Europeans. And what Marco Polo is actually credited for is opening up Europe to the Far East. Yeah. Of course, the Europeans understood very well that there were so many different worlds. There was the African world to the south, the Far East, and so on. They understood that. But there was absolutely no real knowledge of those worlds other than, well, we know that they produce silk, for example, the Chinese. But other than that, there was no awareness, no knowledge about Chinese culture, Chinese society, Chinese language, Chinese markets, nothing of that sort. So this is what Marco Polo is intending to do, just visit the Far East and bring from the Far East something that he will think that will find a market in Europe, something that the Europeans will buy and will be able to pay silver, gold, for that matter. So he goes into the Far East, he visits China. He actually was welcomed by the Chinese emperors at the time, which was a dynasty from Mongolia. It was really a Mongol dynasty. He was received by the Mongol dynasty, and he was actually allowed to live in the royal court for many years. So even though he was not an official ambassador of Europe in China, he almost kind of was, because he was like the European eyes to the Chinese, in that the Chinese were able to see Europe through his eyes, in other words, and understand Europe in ways that no other Chinese or member of the Mongolian royal family will be able to understand. Aspects of European society, like Christianity, for example, social organization, how people lived in Europe, the kingdoms, and so on. He pretty much provided that kind of knowledge to them. But at the same time, Marco Polo is also going to learn a lot from his first-hand experience of Chinese civilization as well. And he was marveled on so many ways about the accomplishments, for example, of Chinese engineering and architecture, for example, technology, agriculture, language, religious ideas, and the like. He was really marveled. He was also marveled about the gold that he witnessed, in China. It was of a different quality. It seemed to be more pure than the gold in Europe, due to the fact that the Romans, for example, during the time of the Roman empires, had mixed the gold that was available to them with other metals, and they decreased really the quality of the gold, had been degraded, for example. And he really just came across a gold that had not been adulterated the way it had been done in Europe. And so he was amazed by the gold as well. So at some point, he's going to head back across the network. He's going to actually take a route south, and he went through the Strait of Malacca as well. So this is one of the reasons why I explain all the different systems. He traveled through there. He arrived to South India, to Calicut, and it is there that he witnessed this world center of commercial exchange. And there he also came across the spices as well. And he was marveled about the spices, and he had just found what he was looking for. He was sure, he was convinced that the spices was going to be that exotic commodity that will definitely find a market in Europe, and this is going to turn the Europeans again crazy, about the aromas, the fragrances, for example, the flavors that are very, very, very intense, very sharp, and this is going to transform, of course, European food culture as well, because up to this time, European culture was rather, simplistic and bland. It was really the European diet, for the most part, was based on eating bread, cheese, and some vegetables. And if you live in the Mediterranean world, you also had some olive oil, some wine as well at your disposal. But everything else is just that, again, on a day-to-day basis. So this is going to really transform, really, the food culture of Europe. So he returns with a cargo of spices. He also brings some silks along the way, tea from India and China as well, and also samples of gold that he picked up in China and also in India, which was rather pure as well. And even though he lost part of the cargo on the way back, it was enough to present it to the merchants in Venice, and there was a kind of like a presentation or world fair, and again, Europeans just simply went nuts about spices. So from this point onwards, Europe is now participating directly. The Mediterranean system, controlled by Genoa and Venice, and the European market as a whole, is going to now be connected directly to the other systems that we described. And one of the major commodities that was flowing around the system, besides silks, was spices. Again, spices. Spices was one of the most traded commodities in the network now. It was something that was flowing across the network, whether we're talking about the Silk Road or the Indian Ocean, for example, the Mediterranean system. Again, spices. This is what's really bringing all those different parties together, and this is really creating the very first international network. Is the very first international economic system, again, that we can actually describe as such. Because prior to that, those were actually regional. Some of them operated on a grand scale, but now it is all interconnected, on this level, as you can see in this map. Okay. So this is extremely important, because this is now creating a new kind of economic system that is not going to rely exclusively on agricultural tribute. Okay, this is an economic system that will rely on revenues extracted from imports exports and taxing trade as well. Okay, so this is now new ways of accumulating wealth, making money, in other words, and state systems have a new way of increasing their treasury as well for their own finances. And of course, this is going to lead to the expansion of state systems as well. Now they have a new source of revenue that will allow them to invest, of course, in not only in commercial expansion, but also on military expansion. Again, so we're going to see in the next topic, particularly the formation of trading empires. So this is really the beginning stages of that. This is why this is important. All right, so part 2, we'll be looking at another engine of change that is going to, on one hand, shatter, dismantle the old institutions, and as a result, bring new structures, the structures of the early modern world. And here we're looking at a more natural or environmental force. This is not something that humans are building like long distance trade, but rather this is an act of nature, in other words. And we're talking more specifically here about climate change. We talked briefly about climate change in the first topic when we talked about, for example, the fall of the Maya civilization. Okay. Now, it is around the year 850 AD that the Earth is going through a change of climate, and this is a global phenomenon, by the way. Okay, so this is not a regional occurrence, but rather is global. It's a global event. Okay, now the Earth goes through alternating cycles of climate. I mean, this is now very well understood by climatologists and scientists around the world. There are, of course, cycles. And this is part of the mechanisms, the functioning of the universe and the functioning of the Earth as well. We go through cycles. And we have, on one occasion, for example, there might be a warm cycle, and it will span for about 4 centuries. And then after that, there will be a cool cycle that will span for about 4 centuries or so. They alternate every 4 centuries or so. They alternate in that fashion. Now, we're not really talking about an ice age here. Again, this is not to say that suddenly the whole Earth was experiencing glaciers and so on. No, but there is a significant drop in temperatures. There are some degrees that tend to drop when there's a cool cycle, for example. Now, what is well known is that when there's a warm cycle, there's more rainfall because there's a warm climate that produces more evaporation of water into the atmosphere. That is part of the rain cycle. So more water is transferred into the atmosphere because of the hot temperatures, and that, of course, brings more precipitation. So, once again, warm cycles produce more rain, and more rain produces more food. Okay, all food comes from rain. There's more vegetation, and with more vegetation, there's more animals to feed on. And with that, of course, humans have more to eat because they can eat the animals, or they can grow more crops, of course. So human populations tend to grow, expand during warm cycles. And this is something that occurred previously before 850. Cool cycles is quite the opposite. There's less water being evaporated, less rainfall, less grasslands, less vegetation, so therefore less animals, less agricultural production. Communities tend to decline as well. Population, demographics as well, okay, tend to decline. So this is exactly what happened between the year 850 to the 1300s AD. What happened here is that as the climate began to change around the world, it affected, for the most part and more intensely, the northern globe. Okay, the northern globe was mostly in largely affected, more so than the southern globe. And so what occurred then is that the nomadic groups that lived in the northern globe will become more active, because the nomads, their way of life was, on one hand, hunting and gathering, but a great many of those societies had entered into the stage of pastoralism. They were pastoralists. They were herding animals like sheep and goat, horses, for example, cattle, and so on, different wild species that were available to them. And they will actually graze those animals in certain areas where there was, enough pasturage. And from time to time, they would trade some of their animals for food products with sedentary society. So there was a certain kind of symbiotic relationship between the nomads and the sedentary groups. They quite needed each other because they both produced different food products, and so more often than not, they traded those products. Those were the kind of relationships. Now, from time to time, the nomads will sometimes attack a sedentary group. They will steal, for example, crops and so on, but for the most part, it was a kind of a symbiotic relationship that traded, again, animals for food products. Now, when the cool cycle hit the globe during this time, the relationships between the nomads and the sedentary groups were altered significantly, because now the nomads are not just producing enough animals because there's not enough rainfall to feed their sheep or goats or cattle and so on, whatever they were grazing. We have a decrease of rain, and so their animal population is also going to decrease as well. So they're not going to have this overabundance of resources to trade with or to survive from as well. Okay? So their animal population is on a decline, and they're going to become very, very, very anxious and very, very nervous as well. And so when we have a period of scarcity, when there are limited resources, human beings change their attitudes towards the world. They become very, very anxious, and the instinct of survival kicks in, so to speak. Okay, survival becomes of utmost importance, and now instead of trading animals, which they are not producing enough, they're now going to raid and invade the sedentary populations. Okay, so they're going to become very active and more aggressive. Now they are on the move. In other words, they're going to now move into the agricultural civilizations, invade them, and to a great degree, not only invade them to loot their resources and take treasure, for example, and leave the way they have been doing that in the past occasionally, but now they are staying there and taking charge, taking control of those societies. In other words, they're going to now take total control of the resources and now install themselves as the new rulers of those civilizations. Okay, so the nomads will now be in charge, in other words. Okay, and this is leading to really the kind of changes that will bring also the early modern period, as we're going to be moving into, for example, the rise of the trading empires. In the next topic, for example, the rise of the trading empires. In many cases, many of those empires were led by the nomads who had invaded certain civilizations, and they were really bent on expansion now, because this is something that they specialized in. The nomads, more often than not, specialized on warfare. they were really warriors. Those were actually warrior societies, as we'll see. So they are going to invade those civilizations and take over, mainly because they had certain technological advantages. They were expert horsemen. Many of them were. They could fight on horseback. They moved very rapidly, and they just overrun the sedentary communities quite easily. The nomadic invasions that happen globally, the major ones, again, this is for you just to have a global outlook here of this process. Some of them, for example, were in Europe, the Vikings. They invaded Europe starting around the 9th century, perhaps even earlier than that, in the 8th century. We see the beginning of the Viking raids and invasions moving into Europe. They were affected by the climate change, and they were taking, of course, treasure, seizing resources, and in many cases invading and staying and pretty much taking control of European kingdoms as well, as you can see in this map. This is again a map of the Viking invasions, as you can see, and this is again the invasions of the so-called quote-unquote barbarians that are raiding the sedentary groups of Europe, the civilized groups, in other words, that were agriculturalists. In Central Europe, we're going to see another group moving out. Those are the Turkic nomadic tribal groups of Central Asia, and they're going to be moving into several directions at different points in time. Some of them invaded India, some of them went all the way to the Middle East, others all the way to even Eastern Europe, and in the process they're also going to be not only invading to take treasure or steal crops, but to actually stay there and take control of certain areas permanently and build their own empires as well. The Turks, again, this is the time when they invade the Eastern Mediterranean. Around the year 1000, they take control of the Holy Land, for example. Eventually, they're going to take control of Asia Minor, in what is today present-day Turkey, for example, conquer Constantinople. They're going to topple that city and take control of Constantinople, and they turn it into the Ottoman Empire. Again, we're going to be looking at that more closely in the next topic, the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which was really a trading empire as well. And those were nomads that were actually moving across this region of Eurasia as a result of climate change. We also look at the, in the Western Hemisphere, in the American continent, groups of nomadic groups known as the Chichimecs that were moving into central Mexico during this time, and they're going to invade the agricultural societies of central Mexico that had been building a series of city-states there in that region, which were really the founders of ancient Mexico, like the Toltecs, for example. They will be invading them and taking over that region. And they will be installing instead a series of warring kingdoms and empires centered on this idea of human sacrifice as well. We will discuss more of that in part 3 of this topic, okay, when we look at, for example, the Aztecs. But last but not least, the Mongols. Again, this is another group that is also going to invade great portions of Eurasia. And this is going to be a more significant invasion, by the way, the Mongols, because they're going to create, in this process of moving along parts of Asia and the Middle East and Eastern Europe, the largest land-based empire in world history. Again, this is at the height of the Mongol Empire. This is all the territory that they control, at one point in time. It did not last very long, but it was the largest imperial system that has ever existed in history. Okay, and they were also part of this change, again, of climate change, moving into places like China, which was an agricultural civilization, and also moving into the Middle East and also Eastern Europe. And once again, they are seizing control of the different principalities and kingdoms and ruling them directly, again, in bringing it together and centralizing it, so to speak, under the leadership of the Mongol rulers. So this is, once again, a very important development that is creating a new kind of world, okay? A new kind of political and also economic system as well. So the world is becoming more interconnected economically, but all at the same time, we see new kinds of leadership as well. Political leadership is also changing because political rulers in different parts of the world, and particularly those that are connected along this network that we looked at in part one, they are being invaded by the nomads, and they are, of course, permanently occupied, of course, by them. And we're going to see that the nature of politics is about to change as well. Again, the nomads move in, they take charge, and because they come from a warrior culture and a warrior society, they're not going to remain content with simply exercising control in a particular territorial domain, but they're going to expand territorially to seize more resources. And as we see this international network being built around the world, at least around the old world that we looked at, they're also going to use trade as a way to expand the system as well, meaning that they're trying to expand the system to seize more resources, but at the same time, they also want to expand trade to also enhance the resources, the revenues that they can be collected as well. Okay, so it's going to be, again, a system based on warfare on one hand, but also on trade, both simultaneously. Something that I will stress once again as we look at more closely at the Mongol Empire. It is very important because it is really the Mongol Empire that will provide the blueprint for the emergence of the trading empires of the 15, 16, 1700s, for example, that will dominate pretty much world trade, something we're going to get to explore down the line in this course. So the Mongol Empire was really that kind of model. Okay. Now, as I said, the background of the Mongols, they come from northern Asia, just north of China, for example. This is a warrior society per excellence. They had domesticated the horse for many, many centuries, and they were expert horsemen. Even at the age of 4, for example, all males were already on top of a horse. It was just part of their culture. They were expert fighters. They could actually shoot arrows on target while riding on a moving horse, for example. I mean, they were just, again, without equal in the world. Now, just like we saw with the Kingdom of Mali, for example, that there were certain ecological zones that were bordering one another, and of course the people living on each zone needed each other and the resources. Here we see the same thing in that the Mongols grazed goats for the most part. They had plenty of goats prior to this climate change. And for many, many centuries, they traded goats for items that were produced to the south of them in another ecological zone in China. In China, it was an agricultural civilization, very productive, and they produced grain, wheat, rice, for example. They produced teas, textiles, and there was an exchange between them, that occurred. So there was this kind of, symbiotic relationship between them. Sometimes it was troublesome. Sometimes the Mongols will raid China from time to time. And this caused also the Chinese to build the Chinese Wall. So the Chinese Wall was built across many, many centuries, over a period of 1,000 years or so. Part of that reason had to do with the occasional invasions of the Mongols and other nomadic groups of northern Asia to keep them out, of course, of China. So that relationship was not always peaceful. But after 850, that relationship became even more and more troublesome with this new cool cycle, for example, that I explained. There's poor pasturage in northern Asia, the lack of resources to feed the goats, for example, was in decline. The goat population was also in decline as a result of this cool cycle. And as a result of that, the Mongols are going to become even more and more anxious, more and more active, raiding more and more communities to steal resources, for example. And they are indeed trying to create a massive alliance in northern Asia, which they accomplished finally in the year 1200 AD. It's a massive confederation. It's really an alliance of different tribal groups. Those were not only Mongols, that included also other nomadic groups, tribal groups of northern and central Asia. So they create a massive force that was used to invade China initially in 1205. This is happening when the Confederation elevates some of their leaders, one of the clans of the Mongols, Genghis Khan, to be the chief of the Confederation, and he leads the attack against China. Again, this is part of this massive expansion. Again, now the nomads are expanding, just like the Vikings were expanding into Europe, invading, and so on, or the Chichimecs, for example, invading central Mexico, the Turkic nomads of Central Asia invading the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Well, the Mongols are also massively expanding across China, for example, in 1205. And eventually, they will conquer China and they will install themselves as the rulers of China. They oust the dynasty, the Song dynasty, that ruled China prior to this time, and they install now themselves as the new dynasty again of that civilization. They install what is called the Yuan dynasty. Okay, the Yuan dynasty is the Mongol dynasty. Okay. Now, they will continue the expansion to the west. They were not settled to having, to just conquer China, but they also want to massively expand to the west as well, which they are doing after the fall of China. And as I mentioned, they are indeed in this process toppling different empires, like the Persian Empire, for example, will be also conquered, and they move all the way to the Middle East, even to parts of Eastern Europe. What is Russia, for example, also fell under the rule of the Mongols and so on. Again, so it's a massive, massive system. And what they create in this process is a new kind of empire that the Mongols realized that there was now a new network that had been developed, for many, many centuries in the past. And this is a vast network that did not limit to the Silk Road the way they understood that there was, of course, a Silk Road, but it was also a network that included Southeast Asia, it included the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean world, and the Middle East. And at least the territories that they have conquered, they're going to take control of that network. And they're going to really create a new kind of empire. And they're going to create, in this case, a trading empire. Okay? A trading empire. This is the kind of empire that they create. Okay? It is the prototype of the modern trading empire. All the other empires that will come after the Mongol are going to kind of borrow many of the practices, many of the functions, and mechanisms of the Mongol Empire. It is an empire that was bent on expansion by warfare and the control of long-distance trade. This is no longer just the empire that is content with just expanding territorially and extracting tribute from the conquered populations the way that previous empires had built their systems. But now it is really the control of long-distance trade. And this is something that the Mongols understand very well, that trade is the most effective way to increase their revenues. So they are controlling the flow of goods along the network. Another thing that they do is that they create a new kind of empire that will blend the military skills that they bring in. The nomads, they are warriors, they really, bring in their skills of warfare, but they have no idea how to administer the empire. So they will have to then incorporate the bureaucratic skills of the sedentary populations that they conquer. They need administrators. They need the bureaucrats. In China, for example, they incorporate the mandarins, the scholarly gentry that we talked about in the previous topic. The administrators, this is the bureaucracy. They're trained in the academies. They pass examinations and so on. They know how to administer the economy, the irrigation systems, tribute collection, you name it, engineering. And so they're going to blend those two skills, the military skills that they bring with the bureaucratic skills of the sedentary peoples, and they create, again, a new kind of machine. This is a new kind of machine. It's very well administered, and it's also bent on military expansion as well. Okay? They also understand that because this is a very vast imperial system, it covers most of Eurasia, great portions of it, that they need a standardized system. A system of weights and measures, for example, across the network when it comes to trade, commercial exchange, commercial transactions, is standardized everywhere. So it provides cohesion and uniformity in that way. And there's also a standardized legal code that is applied everywhere as well. So it's very uniform. Okay? And so again, this provides the blueprint for how modern day empires will function as well. The need for uniformity, standardization in terms of weights and measures and a legal code. It is also an empire that incorporates a multiplicity of different ethnic populations. Along the network, we talked about that, in the Silk Road and so on. It's a multiplicity of different ethnicities, linguistic groups, and they're all integrated. The Mongols make agreements with the nomads that live still in the plains, for example, and the nomads provide protection, as a matter of fact, in the network. And this is how the peace was maintained. There was a certain peace, along the network, because everybody understood that, we're all just going to carry out our economic activities, our commercial activities. Goods could flow across the network without any problems because the Mongols were offering that protection. They made alliances with a multiplicity of different ethnic groups that received payment, for example, or certain benefits to maintain the peace, not to attack the merchants, not to harass them or steal their cargo, to maintain the peace again. And so again, this created a kind of peaceful coexistence of different groups along the empire as well. This is something that was called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongolian peace, that during this empire, again, there was a relative peace taking place within the empire that allowed merchants to operate without fear, again, of being attacked or invaded, again, by other groups, because the Mongols understood the significance of trade, and so they offered that protection along the network. Again, the Pax Mongolica. Okay? So we see, again, the emergence of a new world. This is the prototypical trading empire of the future, even though this empire will come to an end around in the 1360s or so AD, for reasons that we will explain in part 3 of this topic. But despite the fact that it did not last very long, it really provided a model for other emerging empires, again, that wanted to imitate on so many levels, the Mongolian Empire. Okay. Now, part 3, I will just offer a quick introduction. We're kind of running out of time, but it is important to introduce part 3, because this is something that we're going to be covering, in the next session. We're going to look at another force of history, another engine of change that is also part of nature. Just like climate change was a force of nature that caused a series of changes in the world, also epidemics were part of a natural occurrence or phenomena that will also alter human societies. It will lead to the rapid disintegration of the old institutions, and will pave the road for building new ones as well. Okay, so long distance trade, climate change, and now epidemics are responsible for the construction of a new world, the early modern world. Now, this is closely related and tied to climate change, the kind of epidemics that we're going to be looking at as we're moving, for example, to the 1300s, for example, AD. In that, as a result of climatic changes, we're going to see animals transmitting certain diseases to humans. Animals are the ones that actually are responsible for all the viruses that affect the human organism that eventually turn into epidemics. And due to the fact that now we have an international network connecting a host of different continents and societies together, epidemic disease that will flourish in one part of the globe as a result of climate change and animals moving into populated areas because of those climatic changes, transmitting the viruses onto humans, now those diseases will go viral, so to speak. They're not just going to affect one kingdom or one city or one region. They're going to affect a huge territorial area that will encompass more than 2 or 3 kingdoms. Eventually, we're going to look at a phenomenon called the Black Death that will be affecting different continents, whether that is Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, and also Europe. Again, so we're going to see the transformation of epidemics into pandemics. Okay, so this is something that we're going to look at very closely in the next session, how epidemics transform into pandemics and how those were tied to the climate, again, to the change of climate. And this is something that emerges from the interaction between animals and humans, of course, and how we're going to look at a major pandemic, the Black Death, shattering the old institutions, particularly in Europe, but also in China as well. And eventually, with the Europeans discovering America and moving into America, we're going to see yet another kind of pandemic that occurred across America with yellow fever and smallpox that really led to the fall of the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire. Again, this is what we're going to be covering in the next session when we return. This is all I have for you as for now. I'll see you then in session 3 when we come back. Thank you.